Hi, folks, and welcome back to another EDGEy Conversation. I'm really excited today. We have our EDGE staff team here, and we have the opportunity to think about the question, are we there yet? How long does change take? So we get some time to unpack and think about where change is happening, what change is, how it's showing up in our lives, and when is change really going to arrive for us? So I'm excited to have Carla, Bronwyn, and Alexandra with me today to talk about this. And to start us off, my first question, I suppose, is what does the word or idea change mean for you? As I was thinking about this morning, I was like, sometimes I feel like we're on different pages. We don't all know what we mean when we talk about change, or we've all got our own kind of personal thoughts about change. So I'll start us off. I was really trying to conceptualize change and progress and growth, because I felt like there was lots of overlap for me in all of those areas, and trying to conceptualize them in the context of anti-racism work and white supremacy and what it means to move forward without leaving people behind. And so how do we navigate change in a really complex cultural moment? And I think for me, change is sometimes innovation, change is sometimes deconstruction, change is sometimes walking backwards. So I'm kind of all over the map today with what change is and what it means for me.
So funny. Thanks, Zoe. When you were speaking right away, I'm like, oh my goodness, progress and innovation and things. You guys are all going to laugh at me. That is not what I was feeling when you said the word change. It's like the opposite. In fact, everything that you just said about change, I'm like, that would be lovely if that's how change happens. But in my life, and every time that there's been a big upheaval, and I'm using that word intentionally, it feels like a disruption, right? Is because things were actually not working, or I had a sense of urgency because things were so bad, and it became finally so obvious that that's not where I wanted to be, that change was finally necessary. But other than that, I mean, why change? Right? Unless you're feeling that sense of urgency in a negative place. And there's nothing wrong with where I was at, but I remember when I had just graduated from my undergrad, my partner had just absolutely dumped me. I was living in a basement apartment. There's nothing wrong with these things, but I was living in a basement apartment, but an hour and a half far from where my parents were. And it was very dark and gloomy, and I didn't love my job. And there was all these things that were against me, where I finally was like, I think I need to do something about this. And so it was those kind of moments where it's so, because otherwise you might just plod along and not change. And guess what? In those types of dark basements, maybe change is needed.
This definitely has me thinking about the plodding along aspect, I guess. And I don't know, one of the more powerful things that someone has ever said to me is that when things don't change, it's still a decision for things not to change. So it's still part of you ignoring things that are happening around you, or, being aware of them, but deciding not to lean into them. Change definitely, in and of itself, is not directional. It doesn't necessarily imply progress or positivity or something like that. But I think one of the things that we kind of get stuck in a lot of the time is the fact that with change, things are always changing. Things are always changing around us. Things are changing in our personal lives, in our professional lives, in our communities, in the world and society. And there's a lot that we cannot do about that. We're always going to live in a milieu of constant change and adaptation around us. So the question becomes what are the things that we're paying attention to, and what are the things that we end up changing with alongside those things, or what things are we resisting? And there's a space for all of that. But yeah.
I think yeah, this is an interesting question. It's unpacking all kinds of things, because I think I quite like change. I like when things are mixed up and you have to do it differently. But as I say that, I also know I like certain routines. There's certain things I don't like to change, right? So I think, some there's a general feeling for some, at least, that the change is like, they don't like any change at all. Whereas I don't tend to be that way, except that there's things that I don't like to change. And like, I was reading a book recently that was talking about like how really small changes can actually make a big difference. And sometimes that's all it takes, is like do one thing differently every day. And what is the long-term impact of that? And so I think when we think change, I tend to think of like massive upheaval, or like those really crucial moments where like things really are changing. You're changing a job, you're changing a relationship, you're changing something like huge. But actually, I just thought it was interesting to think about this, like how small incremental changes can actually make a huge impact. And I tend to think of the change as being positive, because I like to think we're always progressing, but I'm also very aware that sometimes, when I think of like changing my clothing, sometimes it's like, oh, I just was going to change back into these PJs that are super, super comfortable and like that I didn't actually want to get out of. And so it's like I like that going back piece too. It's like sometimes you change to get back into your comfort zone, right?
Thanks for that, Bronwyn. I think like I'm so excited by this conversation, and I heard little bits and pieces of it in everyone's story around like change is like feeling work. Like there's so many different like feeling tones or things attached to change. And so like I'm wanting to lean into this, like, how do you feel about change? Because like I love change for the sake of change. I was just telling Carla earlier, like I swapped full bedrooms this weekend. Like just like out of nowhere, I was like, yep, I am swapping these full bedrooms. Things don't feel right. So like for me, change just for the sake of having change or having something new is like, I am energized by it. I think it's exciting. I want to run like full speed ahead without planning, without thinking, without considering consequences. I'm like, change is that way. I must run towards it. But I also recognize that that is not true for lots of people. And then I think about how like COVID has upended people's lives. And that's been a massive change for folks to contend with. And that has like, I'm like, would I run full speed at COVID? If I would really have to sit with that and think about like, would I run full speed at such a big change again, knowing how much I love change and how I associate lots of positive feelings with change.
Oh my, I think I did run full speed at COVID. Like, wait a minute. No, but I think that I love this. It's the heartstrings and the feeling around change. And it reminds me of, the saying, are you a glass half full or a glass half empty? And how it's really your perception that you bring to change, how that is actually how you're going to feel about it. And I know that Reverend Clara King, who actually runs our adaptive leadership, she doesn't say, she's like, I'm neither of those. I'm one of those people who keeps on looking at the glass and saying, can I fit in more? Which I'm like, oh, that's a new one. I like that too. But when I think how I feel about change is that when it happens and when I've identified I'm ready to move out of this basement and make decisions for myself, it was because it was needed. And so what's interesting for me is when I go into, and I do have change and I've made the decisions and I have agency in my life of like, this is something that I'm going to embrace and to live fully into, how rewarding that is. I would say that after a change has happened, even if I was fearful of it or had whatever other negative emotions about it, once it's happened, one of my go-to phrases is like, best day ever, because it's this new thing that I'm living into that I couldn't have even imagined it because it was scary and fearful on this other thing. But once you actually go over that bridge, how it is so rewarding to be living into that new thing.
This definitely makes me think a bit about the weight of change and the way that we kind of look at different changes in our lives. Like I have a morning routine. I love my morning routine. I get up, I have a very lazy coffee. I listen to an audiobook and maybe do a puzzle on my phone or something. Like it's just kind of slow and it's wonderful. And to be honest, I don't want to change that. But like, other people might be fine with changing their morning routine. But like, I've also lived all over the world, which I feel very lucky to do. But a lot of people are like, no, I need to be close to my family, or I need to be close to this, or I need to have like this other sort of sense of security. So I know that like the way that we kind of look at change and the way that we evaluate change ends up also producing these different interesting tension spaces or conflict spaces where, you know, we can either kind of like lean in together and be like, oh, okay, this is like the weight that I put on this particular change, and this is the weight you put on this change, and like they're different, and therefore like we need to figure out a way to meet in the middle or compromise in some way. Or I feel like a lot of the time we just kind of completely disregard like what the weight is of those changes for different people, where we kind of look at everything as equal across like multiple people, and then just assume that, you know, we have like a full scope of the picture, whatever we're feeling going forward. And I'm also like, I guess one of the things that came up for me as well is just this idea of sentimentality or nostalgia, and the way that change like offers the gift of having those things. Like without change, you wouldn't necessarily have sentimentality, or you wouldn't necessarily have nostalgia, because there isn't something different. So like there is like a nice outcome that happens at the end of it, even if the change itself wasn't what you expected.
I really like that idea of like the weight of change, because I think that brings for me, Zoe, I'm like you, I love to like rearrange a space and I will do it on a whim, and my husband's sort of gotten used to that. But when I think about it though, it's also like change I can control, right? Like, so that's part of the fun part, is that if I don't like it, I can change it back, or we could try something else and stuff. But I think that there's so many times that change is not a choice, and it comes from outside, from some force beyond ourselves, and that can also bring a lot of grief with it, or as I like that term, weight, Alexandra, where it's like, because there are things riding, or maybe it's a sentimental or a comfort level or something we're used to, that when it's gone or different, it does take a while to adjust. Like we have to change in response to that change. And I think COVID's like a huge example, but I remember I was at a church once who the UCW, the United Church Women's Group, had always done the coffee hour, and they didn't have the capacity. We talk about capacity sometimes. They just did not have the capacity to do it anymore. And what was nice about it is they had to open it up to the congregation, which was really hard for them to do. But it meant other groups could take on some of that responsibility. And I was running the youth group at the time. And so it was like my favorite thing ever, because they had drawn up this incredibly helpful list of like the 10 points to set up, you know, you turn this on first, you turn this on second, like you get the cookies, you do those. And it was like this very efficient, incredibly efficient order, because they've been doing it for so long. Plus they didn't have the capacity to like run back and forth. And then when my youth group did it, they did it so out of order, and they did it so inefficiently. And they were like running back halfway across the church, and they were like, oh, we forgot napkins. And they ran back and all this stuff, but they actually had the energy for that. And it was this really funny thing where like, you know, it was a science. They had it down to a science of like, this is how many cookies go on this table and this and all this stuff. And like, you know, I'll be honest, my youth group kind of ignored those rules. What they ended up doing is putting out more Oreo cookies. And like some of the people that had done this for years were like, no, we're going to run out of Oreo cookies. And you know what the response was? The youth group had noticed that at this one table where all of the UCW gathered, they only ate Oreo cookies. So like they were actually like, but we've noticed that you actually only eat these cookies, and so we have to put out more of them. And like, so anyway, they just rearranged, and they were like, oh, maybe we should just buy more Oreo cookies instead of these other cookies that like nobody actually eats. So anyway, it was this really incredible change, but it was also like painful and awkward, and there was learnings in it too. So I think that that's the beauty of change, but also the weight. I like that, the weight of change. It was really hard to let that go and be out of control for that group. So, which is real.
I'm having sort of an aha moment of like, I want to circle back to this like sense of like the feeling part is what's underneath starting change or initiating change in our lives. Because I feel like at Edge, we hear that all the time from people. They're like, we need change. We know we need something different. How do we do it? And like, is the answer feel your feelings? Like, is that how people are going to get there? Because I'm like, I swear I hear this every day from folks. It's like, we need change. Something has to be different. And then it's like, we get to this stopping point
Definitely agree. I think that one of the things in therapeutic practices or in counseling is that like when you externalize something, you end up being able to move forward with it. It's like one of those moments where you're like, okay, if you give a little bit of your burden to Jesus, like in prayer or in conversation, then like now you can carry it together. And so maybe part of like this, you know, what you were saying around feeling your feelings is like this sort of okay, like there's a, it's, you have permission, I guess, to feel all of those things. I know that like in our society, we've taken away some of those permissions in the past and in the present, where like we say there's decorum or like particular ways of being that you should be in different spaces. And that kind of prevents people from bringing their whole self or their whole feelings to the table. But I think that some of that is starting to shift and that there's a bit more openness and like willingness for people to like receive when somebody is being more open like that. And I think that there's Carla reminded me that there's this frame that we're given in the Bible, in this story that we're in right now, between Lent, like walking through Lent and then journeying through the Easter season, that is all over the place. And it's all over these different markers of change. You know, you're starting with this like wandering in the desert, you have temptation and easy quick fixes that like feel like the change you should go toward, but really like don't change things or don't change things in the right direction. You have like times of discernment and trying to figure out for yourself like what is God calling me to, or what is the right direction to go in, and really like teasing out those different possibilities and opportunities, and then like choosing to like lean in and embrace the call that you're being called to. Maybe that's like, you know, something simple, and maybe it's something more complex. But it's in that moment, it's kind of like when on Palm Sunday, when Jesus comes into Jerusalem, and then there's grief. You know, Jesus like died before he ascended to heaven. You know, you might be grieving what the call means or what this change means in your current life, or like in the life of your community. And then there's like celebration when things start to go well, or when things start to like gain momentum and you're figuring out what the next thing is, and you're really able to see like tangibly see how the Spirit is moving in life. And then there's also some blindness with that, where like, you know, you're on the road to Emmaus, Jesus is there, you can't see him, like you can't see like the beauty that's kind of emerging or the change that's happening. But then all of a sudden you are in a different place than where you started, and you may not even remember the full road there, but somehow you got there and the change has happened and that transformation has happened. And you can see things in a different way. And that's kind of like Pentecost, when you have all of these different people speaking in different languages and you can understand each other. So, you know, like this sort of like frame that's going like, oh, it's good, it's bad, it's good, it's bad. Oh no, I don't want to do this. God, why? And then, you know, kind of leaning into it, like we're given a whole entire story and frame on which to like lean into. So yeah. I don't know how good I am personally at leaning into that story. I think I get stuck in the thinking phase a lot of the time before the action phase, but yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alexandra. I think something that really stood out to me in what you said there was this sense of like what then becomes tangible. So then I'm like, where are we seeing change? You know, what are the tangible things that we see that let us know that change is happening? And I think for me, I know I've reflected on this quite a bit within our team, but just like curiosity cohort for me is the biggest marker of change that I'm watching in my life right now. So seeing folks from different faiths, different communities, different congregations come together and watching them over a 5-week period. And it's just like, I couldn't even begin to put words to the amount of change that is happening. And some folks are doing like small scale change, like they're deciding to move from pews to chairs. Some people are like starting full blown after school programs with like 6 different partners. But it's so cool to see all of the different ways that change is happening and like how people are finding themselves within that framework or story that you just offered us. And I think what I love about the framework you offered is like, it's really good for me to cue into like, yeah, change is happening in really small ways and in really big ways. And like anywhere along that like plan or journey is a great place to be in change.
Yeah, I think I similarly have seen the change in the curiosity cohort. I think it's so great to hear it be part of those conversations about just like what else might be possible. I think also I've heard in many communities of faith, like things have changed. I mean, COVID has brought about some more rapid change in the last 2 years. And maybe it has helped some congregations admit that the way like their makeup, their membership, how they're operating has actually been changing for quite a few years. So for some that's fewer members or fewer participants, for some that's more or a different makeup than they used to be, but they hadn't quite realized who was actually sitting beside them. And so I think that COVID has sort of helped bring that into focus because people have had to so intentionally try to connect with their communities and through online and Zoom. And then even in coming back together now, I think many communities of faith are able to come back in person or in some format and have gotten used to the online. And we hear a lot of hybrid conversations happening about we're going to do it all. Like we're going to do the online and in person and do all of these things even better. So I think that the openness is there. Like I hear change there, but I think in that I also hear, I guess when I hear that, I also have concerns about like how the impact of that change, like some of it is really positive and some of it is really tiring for folk. It's really draining. And so just conscious that it's not just the, congregationals that have had to change, but also families and friends and lifestyles throughout the last 2 years. So I think that that's also a piece of that. So what's exciting, I think, is the communities that are really trying to intentionally say, okay, how can we come? How do we change what we were doing, or what we were doing has already changed. So what should we do now? Like it's actually a new choice, sort of like Alexandra was saying, like not making a choice or going back to how it used to be is a choice. Like that is it's not necessarily a change.
Yeah, thanks for that, Bronwyn. I think it's funny because like our initial sort of question or wondering today was like, are we there yet? Like, when does change arrive? And I was listening to you talk there and I was like, oh yeah, but change is just happening all the time. Like we are constantly in this like ebb and flow of the lifespan of change. And like what Alexandra said, like even not changing is a decision to stay somewhere or a decision to be in a particular way. And so I think it's funny that that's like this has been the cue for me to get there, is like, we are constantly changing. There is no like, are we there yet? Because it's really this journey process versus this destination process. And then I think I hear you saying this piece around like, how do we maintain the energy? How do we navigate the grief and the hard part of change? And how do we keep up the excitement and energy and like desire to keep pushing towards change or keep living into change fully?
Yeah. This is all like sparking also for me this question of like, how do we anticipate change? How are we leaning into learning how to change when things are small changes? And like, how are we learning how to change when things are big changes? And like, where have we ignored the change along the pathway, or like the calls to change, or how have we answered them? I know that, this question of like how to have more young people in worship or what have you is like one that is on many people's minds. And in the past, it's been like, let's have more contemporary music. And that was the change. And yes, it is a change. I'm not going to deny that it's a change, but like, how has the change then lived out? Like what has happened as a result of the change? I think like what you were saying, Zoe, is that like change is not the destination. So like if that was something that did happen, that you have a praise band now, like how have you now continued to use that praise band to do something else? Like how has the change like kind of tumbleweeded in life forward, or like in a particular direction? Or is it just kind of like, oh, well, we did the change and now we're good and we'll keep everything else the same, and that's it. I think I feel very aware that a lot of communities, or a lot of the ways in which people are accessing their spiritual communities is changing very rapidly over the last 50 years, and even more over the last few. And so how we respond to that, and then also make sure that we don't get stuck in that same story that we've talked about before of the decline or of sadness or of grief, but like allow those feelings to be there, and then also lean into like, okay, well, what am I going to do about that? Like, what are we going to try?
Thank you, Alexandra. I think you're like, there's multiple ways to go there. And I think it's, I think that's actually what's really exciting about this conversation. And I think that that's a great conversation. I think you had said too, like how we approach change or how we respond to it. And I think that that's what we really need to keep asking ourselves. Like in some ways, maybe that's our approach is the thing that doesn't change, maybe, right? As a community of faith, as a Christian body, like if it's a Christian movement, it's, you know, it's a community, it's that, like, how do we address those things as they come up? And I know, Zoe, I think even right at the beginning, you were talking about like how do we incorporate some of our anti-racism, like training or highlights, and all of those things. And those things are changing, but it's really engaging in those conversations, right? Like the ongoing conversation of being in community and in relationship. And that's never still, because we're never still in a way, and the communities aren't. So I think that that's just such an interesting question. And I think I am seeing a lot of communities of faith asking those questions and not necessarily, you know, struggling with what to change or how to change, as you say, like the praise band, or sometimes it's like pull out the pews. And like I think maybe in that sense we're not there when it feels like those are going to be solutions of some kind. I think if I've learned anything with working with Edge over the past over a year, is that there's no like solution or fix or way to suddenly grow the church, which is often, or get the youth in, which is often what we really want to do for like good reasons too. It's not malicious or really good intentions. But then I think the ongoing question is like, which change is right for which communities, right? And that's tough to discern. That's like ongoing work always. So I probably got off topic, but I think it connects to change, right? What change is worth doing and why would we do it?
No, I think you're completely on topic, Bronwyn, honestly. You're kind of leading me to my last question. Our last thing we might explore today is around like, what are we seeing as change in the future? And I think you kind of started that conversation for us, Bronwyn, around like, you know, solutions or fixes or what next. But yeah, like, where do we go from here with change?
No, 100%. I was feeling that from Bronwyn's as well. We're just like and it's so funny to me. I've had so many communities of faith approach us and say, Carla, what is a social enterprise that I should create? Because that's like the study or like the perfect model. And then they realize that we're not looking for perfect. We're looking for context. We're looking for what's needed. We're looking to actually build the relationships that Bronwyn was talking about and really lean in. And so I love the question though of like, what change do we see? And then rooted in your question before, Zoe, of like, how are we feeling? And I think like when we talk about proof of concept, when we talk about like, is it worth an experiment? It's all about following the energy. But what is the energy? Well, that's actually following our feelings. And so I was thinking through, well, where do we know and feel the energy right now? And I would say one thing I'm seeing with the lifting of restrictions with COVID is that there's been a sense of disempowerment and disenfranchisement through this whole time. And it feels that right now there's a feeling of empowerment. Like I felt like I've been stuck in my home. I have literally been stuck in my home. And now actually I can look around and feel empowered, which I think has been leading into the great resignation. Like I'm not talking about church trends. I'm going outside, right? Because that's what matters. That's our neighborhood. There's no lines. Come on now. And so I think that that is this whole new sense of, you know, we are empowered. We can actually look out for ourselves and we can look out for each other. I think another big trend is this idea, like through COVID and the pandemic, people have gotten meaner or nicer. Right. And so I'm not telling you where this is all leading. I think that I'm just the feeling about the changes that we need to be discerning and curious about and thinking about, which will really lead us into what change is needed or what change that we're feeling and we're ready for.
Yeah, I love this, Carla, because I think and I think it was Alexandra who said it earlier, like this sense sometimes that change happens to us and we just are sort of recipients or we're along for the ride, but thinking about a future of change where we're really empowered to make changes or to be agents in change, and thinking about how we use that or how we maneuver that towards the good that our community needs or the things that will help us thrive in community and in relationship. I think that's the future of change that I'm really excited about, that I want to be active in moving towards. And so that for me feels like this, like, yeah, just this really nice way to get behind change, to be excited about change, and to use it as like an actual tool, not just as something that we all have to kind of sit with or experience, but like it can be an actual tool in our toolkit about how we get places together. Yeah. All right, folks, thank you so much for joining us for EDGEy Conversation today. It's been really fun to think about change. I am always looking forward to hearing more stories of change from my colleagues, from folks out in community. So if you want to be in touch with us, please do. Come to Idea Days, come to Curiosity Cohort, come sit with change, learn how to use change as a tool, and we will see you all very soon. Thanks, folks.